My session is like right after the group break. So, and I've done everything else. So do you want us to come back or sit down? Yeah. Right, right. So at that point, yes. Yeah, it explodes.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for the Outputs and Recommendations plenary session. We have a very interesting lineup of presentation, and we've decided to break up this session into three different blocks. So we're going to have the first block, our chairs from the groups that have a final version of the recommendation ready for publication. Then we're going to switch it on to a couple of very interesting collaboration and adoption projects focused on the recommendations and outputs. And then in the closing part of the session, we're going to give you a glimpse of what's coming up and what you should be looking out for in the next plenary as final recommendations. So without further ado, Larry is going to present the final recommendation of the Data Type Registries Working Group.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming at this early time. So, data type registries, which was one of the first working groups established back in 2013. We've gone through 2 iterations of the group, and we're trying to come to a closure in this one. The problem. There, that works, okay. The problem is right in the wheelhouse of RDA. It's about interoperability. I like this first statement so much that I'm just going to read it. Data sharing, if I can, because I have to get closer. Data sharing requires that data can be parsed, understood, and reused by people and applications other than those that created the data. So if we're going to share data, we have to explain it. This is, if there's going to be a series of bumper stickers coming out of RDA, I think one of them should be that simply making data available is not sufficient. In fact, it can be dangerous. If you make data available, nobody understands it, it's subject to misuse. So, but we do share some data now. How do we do this? Well, with documents, we do this because through formats and human understanding. Documents are intended for human beings. So all we need to do for the computer is instruct it how to render the document. And that's what MIME types are for. So one way of thinking about data type registries is MIME++. This doesn't work with data. There's an old hoary joke about today's baseball scores are 7-2, 8-9, and 10-12. It doesn't tell you anything if you just have numbers. You might have a matrix, for example. You know that a certain cell has a number 7 in it. You know it's a whole number. You might even have some sort of cryptic row and column labels. That doesn't really tell you anything. It might tell you it's a temperature, but you don't know if it's a ground temperature, an air temperature, the instrument that calibrated it, etc. So you need a way to precisely characterize data. And the effect, this is the RDA template for this session. Who does this affect? I think it affects everyone. It's really infrastructure for infrastructure. All right, highlights of the recommendation. Well, the first version, DTR1, was adopted happily as an ICT tech spec. And we got out of that group the confirmation that this was interesting and important to people. And that remains pretty much the primary result. We still have a prototype registry which is being used. It's uptake in a number of projects, other RDA groups, so it's turned out to be a popular concept. And the prototype, the beta uses have gone into reasonably wide use for an RDA recommendation. The current state is the continued adoption, multiple type registries, but we have failed to get a standard on a minimal type record, and we have failed to get a federation or governance structure in place. So the notion is out there, practice is continuing, but we need more formalisms around it. And to this point, the working group has not been able to accomplish that. All this will be discussed in the DTR breakout later today. We have a number of open issues. We might turn into multiple working groups. We might have an interest group around this. And there's a draft report that'll come out of DTR2. I don't think it'll be a recommendation, but it'll be a report on this state of things. And the International Standards Organization, ISO, IEC, the metadata group, has great interest in this, and there's more on that later. So that's one possible path going forward for the DTR. The impact, infrastructure for infrastructure, the impact will vary by discipline and process. So here are some example use cases. It's already the case in PID resolution. The way you understand, at least in the systems I'm responsible for, the way you understand and interpret the resolution information that comes back from persistent identifier resolution is all the information is typed. That's what makes it extensible. you can add new kinds of data that comes back from PID resolution, and the rest of the world is able to understand it by looking at the type. The thing that we thought of to begin the group is we need to characterize data sets. If you have a workflow, typing can help you decide what to do next with the entity that you have in place. And it can be used as search criteria. This was not something that occurred to me when we started the group, but it should have, because of course you might want to find information, data sets, objects by the type of object that they are. And we hope that you would develop and advertise services associated with types. And then if all this works together, the open availability would introduce the network effect into this. The hope is that there'd be many more advanced services based on automatic processing of data objects based on their typing. So endorsement and adopters, we have the ICT technical spec, that was nice. We have multiple RDA groups and affiliated projects. Data fabric, talks about this a lot, the PID, Kernel Information Working Group, the Collections Working Group, RPID, which is an NSF project at Indiana University with help from Tufts and CNRI, has deployed it in a prototype network, which other people are welcome to participate in. The Deep Carbon Observatory was an interesting and early adopter. They don't use the type registry, but they took the notion and they changed their ontology. And so it's used as a search criteria, among other things. C2 Camp, which is a project that many of you may have heard about just starting, a group of folks interested in pursuing a certain approach, a digital object approach, and the data typing is implicit in that. Vermont Monitoring Cooperative, an interesting group of folks who are trying to track what's happening in the forests in Vermont. They found types to be very useful. EPIC, Ulrich Schwardman is one of the heaviest users of this big experimental use, and there are a bunch of others. And then we have ISO SC32 Working Group 2, of which you'll hear more about later. The question there is whether this is new or it should be part of one of the existing metadata standards. The one that comes to mind is 11.179, which some of you may know. Okay, RDA, they're asking RDA to help with this. And Denise Warzel, who represents that group, unfortunately couldn't make it. You'll hear more about that later. I will give her slides in a little while. Any questions? I took it, that's what that meant.
No, I was actually saying that we're going to take questions afterwards.
Oh, we're going to take questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Larry. So David is going to present the research data interoperability working group output.
Is it? Oh, I don't see it on the monitor. Okay. All right, well, this might be slightly challenging since I can't see it, but all of you can see it, so I guess that's the important part. So, hi, I'm David Wilcox. I work with Duraspace on the Fedora project, and my colleague Thomas Yekel is my co-chair in this group. Oh, perfect, I can see it now. This will be much easier. So we had a working group on research data repository interoperability. To summarize the problem very briefly, I think this is quite well known, but interoperability between research data repository platforms in general, is a big challenge for many reasons. Certainly heterogeneity in terms of data models, lots of different metadata schemas and standards, in some cases no standards at all, differences in semantics and interfaces. So this is a really big problem. And it was one that we wanted to kind of slice off a small part of this problem and try to tackle it in the context of this group. And so one of the first things that we did was to do a kind of survey of the landscape to try to understand what is the state of the art, what are some of the standards and tools that already exist that can help to address part of this problem. I'll mention on a further slide here, we published as an initial output of this group a primer on this topic to try to explore some of these things. And generally what we found is that there are lots of tools and standards that start to address this problem, but they're limited in various ways. So, for example, OAI PMH is very well adopted, but focuses only on metadata. There are some upcoming approaches that are extremely promising. Things like Resource Sync, I think in particular, are really good for this. But we were looking for something that would have a relatively low barrier to implementation. In particular, we wanted to try to come up with something that was very lightweight, that could be implemented not just by new platforms, but could be adopted by users of existing legacy platforms, customized platforms that wouldn't require a bunch of updates to the code of those platforms. So in terms of use cases, very simply we were focused on trying to be able to exchange a digital object between two different repository platforms. So kind of machine interoperability at some level. That could happen in a variety of contexts, migrating between instances of the same platform but different versions, or potentially migration between two completely different platforms or even across domains. So we wanted to take an approach that was domain agnostic, but that could have a fairly broad impact. So that's just the link and to the primer document. That was the first output of this group, as I already mentioned, and this really just kind of is a listing primarily of existing technologies and kind of describes what they do and what impact they might have on research data repository interoperability. Because we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, we wanted to understand what's already out there and hopefully adopt a solution that incorporates existing standards rather than coming up with something on our own. And what the group eventually came up with was a consensus around an approach based on Bagot, which if you're not familiar, Bagot's an open standard specifying how you can package things in a file and folder type structure. So Bagot's fairly well adopted, fairly easy to use, but does not itself have a lot of, it's not very opinionated on the structures of or the contents of the bags, which is part of the point of using it. So our recommendation is essentially to use that standard, but then to apply some additional methods here. So for example, being able to include metadata, whatever metadata you're already using. So we're all using different metadata, different schemas and standards and formats. And what we're basically saying is, there is a metadata folder, and you can put whatever metadata you have in whatever format you're using in that folder, and we've specified a naming scheme there to make it work. But then to also include in that folder a data site record. So the idea here is that you want to include all of the information that you already have. You don't want to lose any information, but the destination platform you're sending your information to might not support or understand the metadata that you have in your repository. So we want to be able to have some kind of basic exchange format. So in addition to whatever metadata you're already including, to include a data site record, which would have a minimal, there are required elements, but also recommended elements that you can include that would give you some level of kind of metadata interoperability to be able to understand the contents of the package. And in particular, I think this was a really good thing that we did with the group, where a data site, as you may know, in the current version requires a DOI, but we wanted to be agnostic about that and be able to support packages that don't have DOIs necessarily or might use other identifiers or no identifier at all. So rather than kind of giving up on data site and coming up with our own standard, which is always tempting, we worked with some of the folks in the data site community to talk about relaxing that requirement in the next version of the schema so that you could have a data site record that could optionally not include a DOI with it. And so I think that's a really great example of kind of working across communities and reusing existing standards rather than kind of coming up with something on our own in the context of this group. And we also have included a recommendation to use Bagot Profiles, which is an extension of Bagot. It's an additional standard that allows you to include some machine readable information, just some more details about the structure of the bag. So this is essentially, we're just kind of adopting a set of existing standards and then recommending a certain approach to use with those standards. So in terms of the impact of that, I think one of the big benefits here is that it's relatively easy to adopt. This isn't something that requires modifying existing platforms. You can use an external tool to extract the information and package it. There are lots of libraries already that can handle things like Bagot, so there's not a whole lot of work to do in order to implement something like this. So relatively easy to adopt. It gives us some support for both current and legacy platforms, and also some level of interoperability, at least on the level of metadata, with the platforms that exist today. So common tool, common format, and a basis for further agreement. So one thing we haven't tackled yet is the actual payload of the bags, the data itself, how to make that more interoperable, and that's a big problem. It has a lot to do with data modeling and semantics and metadata standards and all that kind of stuff. But I think this is something we could use to build on. There is actually a session coming up after this one on a Birds of a Feather session on research data packaging, which we'll be talking a little bit about this, but other things as well. So I think there's lots to build on, and what we've done is really just kind of a first effort at some minimal level of interoperability. So there are prototypes already. We had representatives from Fedora, but also ICAT, Doraya, and KIT. So, and there are some tools that already exist. We demonstrated this yesterday. There's a GitHub repository that has a demonstrator, a generic profile that you can use to get started. So, so in addition to the actual recommendation, there is already some tooling and prototyping that you could potentially use. And of course, we're now interested in more adoptions and further input. So we still are going to be going through the community review process, so you'll have an opportunity to provide some feedback there. But we definitely want to have more adoptions of this. And so if you're interested, please get in touch with one of us, and we'd love to talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Now Anne is going to give us an update on the RDA TDWG metadata standards for attribution of the physical and digital collection stewardship. So thank you, Anne.
Hello, so I will not repeat the name of this working group. So my name is Ann Tesson, and my co-chairs are Matt Woodburn and Dimitris Kourias, who are both here today. So we all know what RDA is, but probably not very many of you know what TADWIG is. This working group came out of the Biodiversity Data Integration Interest Group, and TADWIG is the acronym for a biodiversity data standards group. So while we are not restricting our recommendations to biodiversity collections, we have our heads in that space, and it was very important for us to work with this standards body. So first, the basic problem is that curators cannot get credit for the physical and digital curation activities that they perform. So this means that because people have many demands on their time, that often these sorts of activities have to take a back seat to activities that they can get professional credit for. And that results in collections being curated or under-digitized, or being curated less than they would be. Oftentimes, object provenance can be lost because we don't have the information about who did what, when, to which objects. And actions may be unnecessarily repeated, which can be a problem if a specific analysis involves destruction of part of a specimen. You don't want to be performing that analysis over and over again. So this is our recommendation in a nutshell, or in one diagram. This is a modeling with attribution after the Provo ontology, which is a W3C recommendation, and it's also very similar to a paper that Simon Cox and Nicholas Carr put out a couple of years ago. So this recommendation is all about keeping track of who took an action on an item or a collection. So we've got three classes here: agents, entities, and activities. Agents are people, essentially. Activities are things that people do, and the entities are the objects that people act upon. And so entities are related to activities. an entity was generated by an activity and an entity is attributed to an agent. Now, we had some disagreement in our group about whether or not we wanted to be able to assign roles to agents engaging in specific activities. So we do accommodate that, but it is not required. So if you want to add a role, you can, but you do not have to. So the impact of the recommendation in the short term is that now we use this partnership with TADWIG to enhance the Darwin Core Standard, which is one of the major standards that TADWIG has ratified and maintains. In the midterm, we are going to work with various adopters to have them adopt this standard within their own collection management systems. And of course, in the long term, we want to have an influence over changes in research culture and the incentives that people have to work on the collections that they are in charge of. So we're hoping that we can have improved recognition of the effort required for maintaining these collections. And we want to incentivize those activities. We want to have more efficiency in generating knowledge from these collections because we have proper documentation of what sorts of analyses and activities were performed on these objects. We would like to have increased viability of crowdsourcing as a model for building these collaborative research resources and increased relevance of existing e-infrastructure that's being stifled by the expert annotation bottleneck. So one thing that I do want to mention is that in biodiversity, we do have a lot of e-infrastructure out there, but it is not as useful as it could be because we need people like curators to come in and populate those e-infrastructures with the seed information that it really needs to get going. And so as far as adopters go, we have some tier 1 adopters like the Natural History Museum in London and iDigBio that we're talking with to see if they can implement these recommendations in their own system. But we also have some tier 2 adopters. So these are people like Impact Story, Altmetric, and Collector. These are systems that would, once museums, for example, start collecting or implementing these adoptions, these attribution standards, then adopters like Impact Story or Altmetric could then digest that information and display it on their website. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And to close up this first round of presentation, we're going to invite Ray Planted to speak about the International Materials Registry.
Yes, my name is Ray Plant, and I'm speaking on behalf of our chairs, Laura Bartolo and Jim Warren, and a great team of people who worked on many different sides of this effort. Point to my left. Aha! So this working group is responding to the growth in the wealth of digital data for material science. And with that kind of growth, it becomes increasingly difficult to know what data exists out there, in particular from the perspective of a material scientist, what data exists that will help me in my particular research. And so we wanted to tackle this with a registry-based discovery framework, and and actually just start with really answering what high-level data resources exist out there. What are the repositories or the databases or the software that I can leverage to do my research? Just to kind of limit the problem a little bit. And so We wanted a solution that could be kind of owned and shared by a whole community, something that could connect users to the resources that already exist, and allow data providers a way to advertise what they are providing to the world, but also allow them to control the descriptions of their own resources in this framework. And so this problem of discovering data in my field is not owned by material science, of course. This is a problem across all domains. And so we wanted to try to tackle this general problem, but in a real world context, a real community that has a problem to solve. And so we went about to actually build what we call a registry federation that can help people find data. And on the left is an example of what our application looks like. That's where users can go in and put a search and find repositories or databases or software products that are related to their search. And they can drill down into those results using material science concepts. And that's what the faceted browsing is on the left. On the right shows how you can register a resource, describe it, not only in generic terms, but in terms specific to material science. So what did we deliver in the end? Well, in our final report, we laid out a blueprint for how you can create a registry federation that's aimed at data discovery. And in particular, we wanted to enumerate what are the standards that you need to put into place and the profiles on those standards that you need to put into place to make this federation work. So we made certain technology choices, things like XML schema, OAI PMH to make this federation work. But if you wanted to set up a similar kind of system for discovery based on other technology choices, like, say, JSON, what are the standards you would need and what are the processes you would need to put into place to make it work? And so we tried to enumerate those things in a generic way. Of course, we needed to some metadata schema to describe these resources. So we used XML schema to develop the resource metadata schema. And we explicitly sort of broke it out into generic metadata based on the usual familiar concepts that they talk about in the metadata interest group. And then also domain-specific metadata. And to do that in a pluggable and extensible way so that if you wanted to apply this system to another community, you take out the material science metadata and plug in your own metadata. And for our material science metadata, we developed, in collaboration with our friends in the vocabulary interest group, a material science vocabulary that would make it very easy for both providers and people looking for data to sort of check off the things that they're interested in. We built this into a piece of open source software which was developed at NIST that features APIs and plug-in schemas. And then we deployed it. We have 2 nodes in this pilot federation, one at NIST, one at the materials data facility. That's part of the CHIMAD collaboration. And we started filling it with records. And we now have about 360 different resources described in there. And we're still working to fill that out even more. So the impact is, I think we've demonstrated a scalable, sustainable network of registries that involves the whole community of data providers to help keep it going. We have a recipe and an actual tool set for establishing such a federation that can be used and adapted by other communities. And in fact, we've done that in a couple cases, which I'll mention in a minute. And I think this foundation that we've laid based on registries is a good foundation for developing more advanced search capabilities that can go in and locate individual data sets and connect users to specific services and tools provided by the data providers. And it can be integrated into all kinds of third-party tools. And I should say, with respect to my friends in the astronomy community, this is, of course, not a new idea. This is something that we stole from the astronomy community, which they have kind of developed a whole framework from registries all the way down to search services that let you, find fine-grained bits of information. So we feel like we have sufficient take-up in our own community in material science to keep going forward. We want to fill out the resources that are described in this federation, not only get more records in there, but also recruit data centers that could host their own registry to be part of this federation, and we'd like to expand it out further into the world, right? and really provide a global picture of all the data that's available out there. And as I mentioned, we have adapted this to other communities. We set up a registry system for the National Metrology Institutes from around the world, and now there's a way to find all the different standard-related data products that all these different countries provide in the metrology field. And then we also set one up for a smaller community of greenhouse gas researchers. And in all these cases, we took the same software, pulled out the metadata that was for material science and plugged in the metadata that spoke their own language of that community. So we're going to press forward and fill this out, and we're open to working with other communities if you think you would find any parts of this useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. There are 2 microphones on each of the lanes. If you have any questions, they're more than available to answer. But in the meantime, I wanted to thank you all for the presentation. It's very interesting to see how things have developed in the 6 months since you've presented the draft previously in Montreal. I saw that many of you have changed, especially the approach towards adoption, which is very interesting because it seems that, well, things are going on smoothly. Françoise, there you go.
I think it could be useful also for the astronomers if you acknowledge the filiation. Do you say that? The fact that IVOA work has been very useful for that and will be expanded still more. It will be useful if it's acknowledged in written in the recommendation.
I'm sorry.
If you write in the recommendation that this was inspired from the astronomy work, it can be useful for everybody.
Yes, indeed, and we have done that.
It is done. Thank you.
You had me there earlier. So,
go ahead.
Also a question to Ray. I saw that this registry is being operated by NIST. Could you say something about how much work is involved in operating this? Is there to be a person or persons to go out and advertise and get things in?
So we're putting in we're putting in work not only to run the registry and to create records that describe our own products in there, but we're also working with the community to get them to register stuff. So there's a little extra work there. However, what we've envisioned is that if you can have many nodes, basically a data center can run a registry just curate their own records. It's not really about going out and getting the whole, describing the whole community. So we're trying to spread out the work across different data centers. And so if you're in this latter case, we hope it's just running the software and entering and connecting it basically to your own existing infrastructure. So basically we tried to sort of set this up to have kind of a graduated level of effort in terms of how you get involved, where it's very easy just to register your stuff, but if you have more energy and more resources to invest, you can go as far as hosting your own registry. I don't know if I addressed your question or not. you want to?
If I may insist, it seemed to me that you have this vision of a comprehensive registry somewhere,
Yes.
especially maybe at NIST. So do you have no idea, or you can't say, or you wouldn't rather say that you need 5 people to go out and advertise it to the world or something? Or Françoise is shaking her head. If there's a registry for IVOA, how many people are working there to do things? Or does it actually work automatically, that is adopted by everybody, simply working without intervention?
Right. Well, I think there is a lot of effort that goes into mobilizing the community to get involved in it, and so we are putting a lot of energy into that, and we have several people working on that. Now, if we had all of that participation, then just running the software, that could be one person. But really mobilizing the community, no doubt, is a big effort.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Hey, thank you so much. So all of these presentations were so interesting to me, and I think that one of the common themes that I saw across them was that each of you is working across different organizations, different communities, different repositories, different institutions, and seemingly in slightly different ways. And I think that's both a challenge and an opportunity that RDA has as a whole. I'm wondering, especially as you all are wrapping up at least your initial round of work, if you could speak to maybe a challenge and possibly an opportunity or a success story in terms of that cross-boundary, cross-domain, cross-institution kind of work.
Hi, Lynn. Well, I will definitely say that we never would have been able to get feedback from so many different disciplines if we hadn't been working within RDA. Of course, as I said, we come from the biodiversity community and we have our own standards body. So if we were not involved in this organization, we probably would have just made something within TADWIG, and it's not entirely clear if the standard that we would have come up with within TADWIG would have been applicable anywhere else, in any other discipline.
Yeah, and I think the plenaries are a great opportunity in this regard because we've noticed certainly every time we do have a session at a plenary, 70% of the attendees are brand new to the group, and that's actually a good opportunity because if we treat those sessions as a way to advertise what we're doing and try to recruit more adopters, more participants, a lot of that does come out of the plenaries. Every time we have a session afterwards, we talk to a few people that are interested in joining up and contributing. So I think there's a real opportunity there.
Yeah, I mean, if people haven't figured it out by now, the value of RDA is bringing different groups together. And if you try to build infrastructure, other things being equal, the more use cases you bring to it, the more likely it will succeed because the more general it will be.
Well, I mentioned this in my presentation, but our group did benefit from sort of talking to the vocabulary people and Gary Berg-Cross and his vocamp to jumpstart our vocabulary development. So I think that's just one example of sort of consulting with these other efforts that was helpful.
Thank you all.
Yes.
Anne.
No. Go ahead.
Anne. Over here. It seems to me that citation is something that is people quite obsess about citing things in RDA, and that your entity-agent pattern, so relating a sample to a person in a particular way, is pretty close to assisting with things like citation. And you've also made that leap that physical things are things like digital things and so on. Has your group actually in its recommendations made any claims or made any suggestions about citation, given that you've recommended a way to represent entity-agent relations?
We have not, and that was a little bit on purpose. We thought that citation is very different from attribution, and we felt that citation was its own working group, which I think it is. There is a data citation working group. So we purposefully just focused on the attribution part.
Yes, please.
Yes, hello. Hi, Ann. About the use of roles and institutions, we are thinking about high-speed digitalization of collections. And for this high-speed digitalization to happen, sometimes the museums would have to source out the digitalization to third parties. In this case, it's important to have the notion of roles to attribute correctly the portions of collaboration that happen into bringing a digital resource from the museum shelf to the internet. So that's something I just wanted to point out.
Great. Thank you. I'm glad that we included the roles in that then.
Yes. Thank you very much.
So my compliments to the form in which these 4 presentations were shaped. And at the last RDA plenary, I recommended from a similar microphone that every one of these presentations should start with what kind of problem it was trying to solve. And this was really done well here. So one remark in that for David. I think yours was indicating a problem for which I know why you're doing it, but the general public can ask, but why would you want that? And I would go a little bit deeper in describing the problem to a more general audience. For the rest, very good, recommended to do it this way.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for that, and I think certainly we could describe, not to go into it in too much detail here, I suppose, but yeah, this issue of interoperability and why it's important. I think we all want to have increased collaboration. We all want to have abilities to kind of share across different platforms, and so that we can better collaborate and do our work. So it's really, there are lots of reasons why you might want to move a digital object from one platform to another, but I think a lot of this is just opening up opportunities to share and collaborate more easily. And in a lot of cases, we have data that's sort of stuck in one platform or one solution, and it's really hard to get that data out. And so being able to share that more openly, it's a big challenge. Machine interoperability is really hard, and we're just trying to kind of start to move more in that direction. But yeah, thank you. I hadn't really said too much about that.
Thank you very much. We're going to stop with the questions for now, just to have time for the other bits we have scheduled this morning. So without further ado, thank you very much for all your presentations and for answering the questions. I'll pass the floor to Lynn, who will present the adoption and collaboration projects that we have ongoing and scheduled, and to Larry to present the first.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks to Larry for sticking around. We have so many groups working at the moment, and especially working groups ramping up, closing out their recommendations, getting started. I think there are challenges and opportunities there, especially in terms of, again, this kind of cross-organization work, looking at standards bodies, looking at external organizations, really thinking about how we can better connect the landscape. So I'll give a preliminary shout out to the Mapping the Landscape interest group, which I think has been really timely in terms of identifying this area as a priority. I do want to note that the TAB chairs meeting and coming out of the working group interest group chairs meeting, there have been a number of discussions on road mapping happening. And so you're going to be hearing more about those in the coming weeks, especially for the chairs, thinking about different different ways to look across RDA groups and to start looking at more effective and possibly more efficient ways of connecting, of identifying either obvious or maybe informal connections that could be expanded. So there's a lot more in this area coming. I think as RDA has expanded so quickly, it's been an area that that there's a lot of opportunity in right now. So we're really thinking across the organization of how best to pull all of these pieces together. So along those lines, unfortunately Denise is unable to join us, but Larry has graciously offered to present her slides in thinking about relationships with ISO.
Thank you, Lynn. So I thought I'd have to start by explaining that I wasn't Denise Warzel, but Lynn already did that for me. She had Denise, who represents this ISO IEC Joint Technical Committee 1. As far as I know, there is no JTC2. SC32 Working Group 2 on metadata. So she starts, she had sent me one version of her slides, and then she decided she needed this new first slide, which is, she's really sorry she's not here. She had reservations, and she had an unfortunate accident 2 days ago. Not going to be a serious thing in the long run, but it prevented her from flying. So she was going to be up here to make a pitch for RDA interaction with ISO, specifically with the SC32 Working Group 2 Metadata Committee. So this to me is good news. Some of this was facilitated by Wo Chang at NIST, so NIST once again provides a lot of assistance to RDA. And RDA is seen increasingly as a fund of expertise across various fields of data science, which is really good news. This fairly significant ISO group in certain quarters, significant, would like to engage more closely with RDA. And specifically, if you go down the list of acronyms, this is the metadata group. Working Group 3 is database languages. Working Group 4 is SQL, multimedia. This group, the WC2, which is probably going to be on the next slide. No, so I'll go back. This is the group that does ISO 11179, which is kind of a meta standard. Some people in the audience, I'm sure, know it. Those who don't, it's metadata about metadata standards. So very infrastructural, very RDA-ish in that sense. So this is the call. Help develop metadata standards at the ISO level. That third bullet, second sub-bullet down shows you who is most active in this particular working group, not in ISO, but in this particular working group. And this is what they're looking for. They're looking for developing new areas of work. I mean, just as RDA is exploring new things that before we were publishing data, before data was so available, the standards didn't matter so much. The standard was the journal article based on the data. Now we need standards for data because the data is available. The world is moving on. So the standards world has to move on. So the last set of sub-bullets there, those are the kinds of things ISO is looking for, an opportunity for people who can engage in important, sometimes tedious and difficult work of developing standards. Which, as you know, if you've been around RDA for a while, we are not a big S standards body. We're at a different level. And this is one way, cooperation with groups like ISO or IEEE are ways to take our efforts and formalize them and distribute them more broadly. Having something as a standard really checks a lot of boxes. It's useful in and of itself, but it's also a credibility issue. And if RDA becomes the initial source for a lot of these things, I think RDA will benefit in the long run. Now, most people who think of ISO standards think, you know, my God, I'm not going to live long enough to get this done. But they do have 18-month issues, 18-month cycles, which is like, you know, really speedy for a standards group. But we also have 18-month standards. So that's the basic sequence of events. And it has to get balloted. You have to get consensus across a fair number of communities. It's not an easy process, but again, I think it's pretty worthwhile if you can make it happen. Here's some currently active items from within this group. 11179 is probably the best known one. It's been around for a long time. It's enormous. And it's not that the group is walking away from 11179. It'll be maintained, but they're looking for ways to move forward. And the data type registry is one possibility in there. You also see the other groups, metadata concepts and usage, top-level ontologies. But then you get down to the bottom, the ad hoc groups. So a colleague of mine at CNRI, Girdar Montepelli, led a group on data type registry. That group concluded as an ad hoc group and now is looking to move forward in a more formal status. And the part of the DTR story that I told earlier that they're interested in and is appropriate for standards body is the data type record structure. What do those records look like? And you see there are potential new areas of work. So define a core model. And the question is, does it use part of or should it leverage, or what's the relationship between standards like 11179 and 19763? They also are looking for meta models for data mapping and top-level ontologies, if you're interested in that. They're soliciting our involvement in these. And, you know, this is the pitch part. I won't be as much of a salesperson as Denise would be. And that's Denise. She works for NIH. She's based in Denver. And she's really sorry she's not here. She will be participating remotely in the DTR breakout session at the end of the day. So those of you who want to ask her questions or interact with her, especially in regards to the data type registries, could come to that meeting and talk to her. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Do you have any questions for Larry or by way of Denise, I suppose? All right, thank you so much. Okay, heading up next. So Mark Parsons has been working with a project pulled together by the American Geophysical Union, Enabling Fair Data, with Shelley Stahl and many others. So he's going to be talking to us a little bit about some of the themes coming out of that group and ways that they relate to RDA. So.
Good morning, everyone. Guten Morgen. So this is a project led by the American Geophysical Union, but it's in close collaboration with RDA and the Earth Science Information Partners and a number of other organizations. And I should say the American Geophysical Union is probably the world's leading, or amongst the world's leading organizations representing the geosciences community. It's a professional society as well as a publisher of Earth and space science journals. And AGU has always had, or for a long time, has had a strong emphasis on data and data management and data sharing. They have had a position statement on data since the 90s that's been updated several times, most recently I think in 2015, and it gets increasingly stronger and more stringent with each update in terms of calling for open and well-curated data. And they received a grant from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation about 6 months ago for an 18-month project to really harmonize the policies within the publishers around how data should be shared behind an article. And then bring the repositories to help support that requirement that the data be available in repositories to support the article. So there's really two high-level objectives for this project. One, to ensure that there are fair, I'm assuming everybody knows what fair is, it's the buzzword today of the day, fair, compliant data repositories, adding value to the research data, well-curated repositories that do everything consistently and well. And then as well, fair, compliant, if you will, publishers who have a consistent policy on how data should be referenced and made available if it's behind the article. It's really a community-driven project. It's led by AGU, but as I mentioned, RDA is heavily involved, and as well as you can see, a number of publishers, a number of other organizations, and many, many repositories. And I want to note the model for this has actually been helpful for RDA, and I think RDA has been helpful for the project, in that the project is actually supporting some of the business, what we call the business of RDA. This is actually my last act, if you will, in my previous role as Secretary General. I am explicitly representing RDA on this project and facilitating the adoption of RDA products. And then Lynn is also paid as part of the Secretariat to help facilitate this project. And then the rest of the money goes towards coordination and travel to bring the community together. So it's supporting the project work, but it's also supporting the general operations of RDA. And I think that's an important model as we go forward. So it doesn't have working groups because it's not trying to do work as such. It's not trying to develop, it's doing a lot of work. It's not trying to develop new things. It's trying to implement and adopt things. So it has these targeted action groups. And one of them is focused on guiding researchers to the appropriate repository. One of the critical issues when a publisher says you need to make your data available in a repository, the question is, well, what repository, where? And so we're trying to develop a sort of a decision tool to help researchers choose the most appropriate repository, ideally a well-curated domain repository for their data. There's another group that is working on this common policy across publishers. So there's actually a statement out there, I'll give you a link in a little bit, a statement of commitment that they have all signed up to that, among other things, says they will no longer accept data in supplements. Data need to be put into appropriate repositories where it can be discovered and reused. Then there's the infrastructure folks that are trying to implement this consistent workflow so that you can cite and retrieve the data and ensure that the peer review process includes review of the data and so forth. And so those are the sort of the three major sort of implementation activities to put this infrastructure into place. But then these other ones are the support activities that really need to happen for this to work. And one is coordinating educational resources on enabling fair data so that researchers understand why this is important and how to do it. And then enabling culture change through credit. As we heard from Anne, credit for data is very important. And then this last one, enabling actionable data management plans liaison, they're not even calling themselves a group. They're trying to liaise between all the different activities that are going on in the world around data management plans and the construction thereof. So as you'll probably see in there's a lot of RDA-related activity in that work. And so explicitly, there are these outputs that are being adopted at some level or another. And I think then the primary one, the most overarching one is the Core Trust Seal. And that repositories that have the Core Trust Seal, we can sort of assume meet those criteria of being a well-curated repository. So that's really central. The Scholarly Link Exchange, SCHOLIX, is also critical in making those connections between data and literature, as well as dynamic data citation, at least the core pieces of it. And then these other three also, I think, have a strong influence as well in the data publishing workflows, because that's exactly what we're talking about. The summer schools obviously relates to the educational activity, and then legal interoperability guidelines in terms of licensing behind data and so forth. So those are the ones that I've noted that very clearly we are adopting in this project. But there is a lot of engagement with working in interest groups across RDA. And so we had a meeting in Potsdam just prior to the plenary, and as part of that so there's probably a couple hundred people involved with this project. And so they're sprinkled now throughout RDA, and they're attending many of the working in interest group sessions at this meeting, and these are the ones that we're particularly targeting. And that URL, if you're interested, gives a spreadsheet of who is where, so you can look out for those people in your sessions. So I just want to leave those links up there for more background information. I'm assuming these slides will be made available, and thank you very much.
All right, we have time for one question for Mark, if anybody. If not, all right. I think we're going to move on. Come see Mark if you have questions. Thank you very much. Or Shelley.
Shelley is the main driver of this, and she's the driver.
All right, thank you all so much. So we've heard from the recommendations that are currently being finalized. We've heard from some of the external activities happening across organizations and across RDA as a whole. And now we want to really spend just a little bit of time highlighting up and coming recommendations. So these are groups that are around 12 months into their 18-month timeline. They are just starting to kind of pull together their kind of closing vision for what their products will be, likely looking for adopters, and we're really interested in hearing more, making sure that the community knows what's happening in these upcoming groups, so again, we can identify connections where we can. So first in this list of the final three, I've got the Rice Data Interoperability Working Group with Shaikh Mira. Please.
Good morning. I am representing Rice Data Interoperability Working Group. I am presenting on behalf of a couple of my co-chairmen like Pierre Larmande representing IRD and Ramil Maulen from International Rice Research Institute, Philippines. I hail from India. I work for Indian Council of Agriculture Research, very specifically for Indian Institute of Rice Research. Okay. And I'll not go into the details of how important rice as a crop is, like more than 3 billion of population depend on rice. Keeping in view the importance of rice as the single most important crop in Asia, Africa, and Australia, and most parts of the world, like we thought that why not work on one rice interoperability working group. So way back in 2016, we proposed this, and in 2017, we got the approval from RDA, and last 12 months or so, we have been working on devising the strategies to bring the thousands of rice research organizations across the globe with standards in relation to the data and metadata as far as legacy data is concerned. And for the first time, perhaps, like we wanted to follow the suit of wheat interoperability group, but we thought that there could be much more which could be done as far as rice, keeping in view the uniqueness of rice research organizations, mostly coming from Asia and Africa. We thought that we should go for a survey with existing resources, very specifically vocabularies, ontologies, data formats, and metadata formats. And a cookbook we wanted to devise very specifically for the rice research organizations. And we wanted to work on a repository of controlled vocabularies, but later on we thought that there are lots of working groups which are working on ontologies and vocabularies. We wanted to draw some insights from those working groups. And two specific deliverables which we committed ourselves are a prototype of rice-specific data registry which we wanted to develop, and something like rice research, organized rice research across the globe dates back to maybe 19th century. Then we thought that why to only speak about digitized data interoperability when we are having like millions of pages of data, like which is worth something across the rice research organizations. Why not work on bringing the legacy data, which is stored in the hard copies into digitalized form and also start talking about data interoperability. And in last 12 months or so, like we could finalize the survey, and we got very good response from across the rice research organizations. If time permits, I'll just pass through some of the slides, wherein which the existing standards and the kind of data which is being stored, both the genotypic and phenotypic data, we just wanted to document whatever minute detail as far as rice data interoperability, that matters to the rice data interoperability. And we started working on a cookbook intended for rice data managers. And it's not the rice researchers who are responsible for working towards the rice data interoperability. Rather, it's like rice data managers or the policymakers. We wanted to take the cues from the rice research managers and how best we can sensitize the rice research managers as far as data interoperability is concerned. As I was mentioning, repository of controlled vocabularies, we are not working very specifically, but we wanted to draw lessons from various other organizations and working groups. And we are almost done with the prototype of rice-specific data registry. International Rice Research Institute, Philippines is taking the lead in this. And on beautiful good practice or a framework for digitizing the legacy data is almost done, and we are expecting that this will be made available through RDA down the line 6 months from now. The beauty in with regard to the rice data interoperability working group is those who are working on the rice data interoperability, they themselves are the adapters or the enablers of the rice data interoperability, very specifically International Rice Research Institute, Indian Institute of Rice Research, and CIRAT, CIAT, and INRA, and of course Phil Rice representing the Rice Research Institute of Philippines. So we are hopeful that most of the recommendations coming out of rice data interoperability working group will gel well with most of the existing organizations so that the adoption will be very easy across these organizations. And we are hoping that since rice and rice research organizations are very unique compared to many other, maybe potato or maize or like wheat, we just wanted to bring very specific recommendations in relation to the rice crop. And we are hoping that most of the organizations which are dealing with rice data will be in a position to readily accept the recommendations of rice data interoperability. And we are just proposing to have an extension of 6 months to 1 year so that sensitizing the policymakers and research managers across these organizations is going to be very tricky. And at the same time, since we are working from within the organizations which are dealing with the rice research data, we are hopeful that maybe like the adoption levels as far as RDA is concerned is going to be very high. And quickly, maybe I'll pass through. What are the very specific RDA activities or deliverables and the status, the objective wise? You just go through this, and maybe as far as data analysis softwares are concerned, and we all know that Galaxy as a data analysis method registry, we just wanted to adopt since IRI has already started working on that, and data type registries, working groups, some insights we wanted to develop from those working groups as well. And good practices is something which I wanted to tell, and as I was mentioning, more than 120 years of rice research data exists in non-digitized formats, and there is no incentive as far as rice research organizations are concerned to digitalize whatever legacy data is there. We just wanted to formulate a framework so that most of the rice research organizations will follow the suit as far as the work which is being done at Indian Institute of Rice Research and International Rice Research Institute. The phenotypic data is something like the metadata standards, not only data standards, the metadata standards and describing various vocabularies very specific to the phenotypic data of rice, which we wanted to do. Like, for example, like dry season, wet season, and maybe summer rice, and each one has a different connotation. Like, we just wanted to work on the details of how to represent legacy data as far as metadata standards are concerned. And quickly, next 1 minute or so, I'll just pass by some of the results coming out of our interoperability survey report. And we have very good representation across 20-25 countries. And the kind of RISE research data generated and shared by various organizations we could document so that we are not reinventing the wheel, rather like we are going to develop within the structural and functional components of various RISE research organizations. And we have been talking about RISE researchers working towards data interoperability, but it doesn't work like that. Can we really sensitize the research managers who will take a call as far as data interoperability standards adoption is concerned? And the data policies, unlike other crops, maybe rice research organizations may not be having the data policies as advanced as the case of wheat as a crop, and the kind of data sets which are most important and prioritized so that you can specifically target those organizations. And the gaps that are existing as far as availability of data, and we just wanted to link it to, if possible, to the fair principles. And the motivation is something which we have been working on, and rice research organizations in Asia have a different setup, and we just wanted to target them. I think that's it from RISE Research Data Interoperability Working Group, and we are hopeful that down the line, 6 months or 1 year from now, we'll have something concrete and also some organizations to adapt to the recommendations coming out of RDA. Thank you.
All right, so let's move on to, we've got the Research Data Alliance Joint Group with the World Data Service, Scholarly Link Exchange Working Group, SCOLIX is the acronym, and Wouter's going to come talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have the same problem as most. I don't see what is there, so I'll occasionally look over my shoulder. So basically, what I'd like to talk about is representing actually a large amount of groups, particularly Crossref, DataCite, OpenAir, but also European PubMed Central, Pangea, CCDC, and I'm actually, the risk of mentioning organizations, you're risking not to mention all, but also Elsevier, Springer Nature, and I'm from Elsevier. What are we trying to solve? We're trying to solve a very simple problem, which is linking data with articles. Because why are we doing that? Well, there is not a standardized way in doing that. And having a standardized way of linking articles to datasets makes them more findable. So basically, we're creating a schema, a standardized schema to link articles to datasets. That sounds very simple, and actually it is. So in the old days, we used to have many connections. 5,000 repositories, 2,500 publishers. As you can imagine, that's actually a multi-million way of solving the problem. That is actually how it is currently implemented in the world. Speaking for Elsevier, we had 60 different ways of integrating with repositories, and we're only one publisher. Similarly, when I talk to my fellow data repositories, they say the same thing. Not any publisher is the same. So we said we need to create a schema that can be adopted by hubs to really make this a more scalable solution. The benefits are obvious. For publishers, this is more scalable, it increases visibility, it's more user-friendly. For research institutes, for data centers, for bibliographic institutes, it's more easy to collect the data. So we're very much related to the Make Data Count initiative. We're very related to the data citation principles. And for researchers, obviously, this helps because they get more credit for their data becomes more findable, and we help them to actually share the data. Our timeline is basically that we're in the group actually heavily debating whether this would be the final recommendation or whether we're still in the draft recommendation phase. Because we've published now version 3 of the SCOLIX interoperability schema. Version 3 is the first schema that really has gone into production. and I'll go into the adoption shortly. So the first schema was published after the first Data Publishing Services Working Group, which presented the framework. The second version was a draft schema that actually, in a great session in Pisa with a large group of stakeholders, we've kind of hammered out in a almost 24-hour session the final version. And the most difficult part there was to keep it simple. We simplified, and that now has helped with adoption. So version 3 is now in production. The reason why we are saying that we're still doing a draft recommendation is that when you go into production, actually the real problems hit you. So we're still now getting responses about how we can improve. So we plan to basically close this group in Botswana in 6 months' time and move into a maintenance mode. But I think the key challenge there is to go into production and make it scalable. So I don't want to go through the details, but when I say we keep it simple, I mean we keep it simple. For data centers and publishers, it's very easy to kind of actually share this information, and it's very easy to pick up this information. Of course, when you simplify things, you lose depth. That is okay. The depth will be delivered by the data centers and the articles themselves, but the key thing is to join this connection. We've also simplified to not yet include, for example, software to data connections or sample to dataset connections. That will, for example, be next steps, and we can imagine that maybe a next working group will be started to cover that. But first, we really want to make this a growing success. So in practice, we used to have 3 hubs, but actually yesterday a new hub joined, which is Europe PubMed Central. So we have 3 hubs that aggregate, collect, and expose large amounts of article-to-data relationships. Obviously, DataSite, because it's close to many data repositories. Obviously, Crossref, because it's close to many publishers. OpenAir, because they love to aggregate this stuff and actually share all the open information. And Europe PubMed Central, because not everything is in a DataSite, and the health sciences are important to include it as well. But it has really worked. So many of these services are now being adopted. I can actually speak for Elsevier. We're now employing this in Scopus, in Science Direct, and we're in the process of feeding this to Crossref. Zenodo, EarthChem, ICPSR are all examples. Dryad, actually not on there, should be on there. They're all adopting this and doing this, which means that, for example, one of the hubs, Scholl Explorer, has already been hit 20 million times since November 2017. My final slide is, so what's next? So we're now operational, and we're really still running into some small issues. So what we're seeking are your endorsements and adoptions, actually implementations. It's simple. Connect to one of the 4 hubs, talk to us, talk to Martin, Paolo, myself, and see how you can connect. Obviously, we're still seeking improvements to the schema. Version 3.0 is not the last version. We now have a change management process once a year. And we seek to coordinate better between the hubs so that also we keep a holistic view. Long term, we're seeking a home for the schema, and we are trying to scale up the support organization. With that, I'd like to thank you, and I'm going to be the first one to make a dinosaur joke. I was at the dinner last evening, and I think if we don't do our work right, i.e. if we don't finish this right, I feel like we're going to end like those beautiful animals last night. Thank you, by the way, for hosting it there.
All right, thank you so much. To avoid fossilization, we are going to keep going. I encourage anyone with questions to come see our speakers during the break. Finally, we've got the Persistent Identifier Kernel Information Working Group to be presenting.
Okay. Good morning. I'm standing between you and the coffee, so I'll try to be quick. I'm standing here on behalf of the group of my co-chair as well, Beth Playley, who's in the audience. So just to get started here, a summary of the problem statement, what did this group originate from? So we perceive there is a lack in the current global middleware infrastructure that has exposed some shortcomings for data identification, discovery, use, and management of data. Simply saying, well, there are no good approaches for automated services dealing with millions of objects in short time frames. So there is a definite scalability, performance, automation enablement problem. What is needed, what was the original intent also of the group, is that we want to inject a tiny, very selected amount of metadata into PID records to enable further automated processes, in particular dealing with these challenges. Benefits should, of course, then be better scalability of the processes, of the tools, of the services, further automation, and also building cross-community solutions, enabling some ecosystem of tools usable across disciplines, across countries, across different infrastructures and adopters. So what's the status of the recommendation? The core of it, the heart that we've spent a lot of time in, a lot of discussion, a lot of honing out the details, are now 7 guiding principles for PID kernel information, describing in a technology agnostic sense, in a way that is supposed to be independent from particular infrastructures, of how you would design that kernel information that you inject into PID records. And again, this is geared towards minimizing human interaction in view of facilitating automated processes. And it's also geared towards long-term stability of the processes relying on that kernel information. So always also thinking about, well, if you put something in there, you have to be aware that you will not be able to change that a lot in the future. So it has to be very precise. It has to follow some of these, and some of the guiding principles are geared towards that. Some of the ideas that this is just a snapshot of something you put in there and it has to stay that way. The draft of our recommendation also includes, of course, the guiding principles, but also a draft kernel information profile with essential properties. I will not go into the details here. It's available from our group homepage. We also have an exemplary high-level architecture that shows how this could end up in the global middleware, and also, of course, use cases and community adoption stories. Our list of initial adopters, this is still fairly open, so just mention a few. The RAPID project, which is basically building a testbed around multiple RDA recommendations, including this one. The European Network for Earth System Modeling, trying to streamline already existing usage of PID records towards use of these, towards compatibility with the guiding principles and use of the kernel information draft profile the group has developed. The DOI Foundation has always been interested in these aspects and would like to evaluate also again the use of the principles and the kernel draft profile for a range of DOI applications. And last but not least, there's also interest from the EOSC services, so in this case, EUDAT service B2 handle for also aligning existing profile usage with the recommendation and the guiding principles. I should also mention there's also further interest by the ICOS S3 and also by the European Persistent Identifier Consortium to pick this up and put it into use services, community adopted solutions. What's the expected impact? So the guiding principles, of course, are geared towards making that whole scalable middleware sustainable, dealing with the performance issues, dealing with this short time frame period where you have lots of possible object interactions. The core kernel information profile can be used as a reliable common core across infrastructure and community applications that will, of course, facilitate the further use of that across disciplines, and also provide some nucleus for community or application-specific extensions of profiles. Feedback we currently desire from the RDA community. I should mention we have our session just tomorrow in breakout 8. Just as sort of an appetizer, 3 open questions that we work towards. Are the guiding principles applicable? Is their scope well suited? Is this useful for many use cases? Are there alternative good approaches to the architecture design? The current way we see this is we have an example based on existing solutions, but this is certainly not the only way this could be done. And also, are there additional service perspectives or other use cases that we would also of course, always welcome? So that's it. Thank you for your attention.
right, excellent. So you just saw some of the upcoming recommendations that you'll be hearing more about at the next plenaries. Just a quick announcement, anyone who has a poster up from yesterday's session, we need to get those pulled down by 11 a.m. So it would be great if you could go take care of that now, and we're going to get the new posters up so we can get some new information out. All right, with that, I'd like to thank all of our speakers, our presenters, our panelists, and thank you. We'll head out to break, and we'll see you in the next breakout session.